Dawn at Naval Air Station, Jacksonville, March 18, 1943. Engines cough to life. SBD Dauntless dive bombers line the apron. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley watches combat-tested pilots climb aboard men who flew through Guadalcanal, not green trainees. 9 months earlier, this same airplane helped turn the tide at Midway. Yet in the last 6 weeks, he has lost more aviators in training than he lost in months of combat. Something fundamental is wrong. Across Corpus Christi, Pensacola, and other fields, the pattern repeats. Textbook runs roll inverted slice into a 70-degree dive hold. The Pipper steady ride, the timing to release, and then no pullout, no mayday, no flutter or fire to blame. The aircraft keeps diving past the release point, past the safe recovery altitude until sea and aluminum meet in a white pillar of spray. Wreckage inspections come back the same control surfaces, intact engines, healthy, nothing wrong except the final impact. It looks as if the pilot fell asleep at the exact second he needed to be most awake. He didn't fall asleep. He did exactly what doctrine taught so precisely, that he flew into a physiological trap the human body cannot reliably survive. By late 1942, the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had seen hints of the problem. By early 1943, the scale was undeniable. Reports used a bland phrase, failure to recover from dive, that disguised a harder truth. The precision and discipline that made U.S. dive bombing devastatingly accurate were killing the men who mastered it. The dead were not corner cutters or thrill seekers. They were the careful ones, the by-the-book aviators who held the dive to the last safe heartbeat, because every 100 feet of extra release altitude could add dozens of feet of miss distance on a maneuvering ship. The mathematics looked simple. The physiology did not. A 2-ton aircraft transitioning from a 70-degree dive at roughly 300 miles per hour into a recovery arc slams the pilot's circulation with forces his body never evolved to handle. At the bottom of a standard pullout, pilots routinely see 5 to 7 G. In those seconds, blood weighs 5 to 7 times its normal weight and obeys gravity, not willpower. It drains from the brain into the legs and lower body. The collapse is faster than conscious thought. First comes gray out around 4 G. The edges of the visual field fade as oxygen-starved retinas shut down from outside in. Then tunnel vision, only a shrinking circle remains, instruments hard to read. At about 5.5 G, many pilots experience blackout, total loss of sight, while still technically conscious. Push past 6 G, and the brain itself may protectively switch off G-induced loss of consciousness. Now match that to timing. A dauntless pullout lasts roughly 4 to 6 seconds. Gray out can begin in under 2. Full unconsciousness can arrive by 4. The timelines overlap cruelly. Just as the pilot must steadily increase back pressure to finish the arc, his vision collapses. Just as he needs judgment, his brain checks out. Hands relax, the pull stalls, and the nose never rises enough. The airplane continues straight into the sea. Sometimes when G eases because the aircraft has struck water or slumped into a terminal spiral, consciousness snaps back in the final heartbeat, granting a flash of awareness with no time to act. Survivors describe a gap, the target in the sight a blur, then wings level with no memory of how they got there. Others leave no testimony at all. Pensacola's centrifuge made the mechanism inescapable. Volunteers were briefed and given the same G onset curves measured in operational dives. When pilots prepared tightening leg and abdominal muscles and using forceful breathing, the anti-G straining maneuver bought a second or two of consciousness. But in real dives, eyes locked on the Pipper, attention saturated, many failed to start the strain early enough. Once the spike arrived, physiology outran intent. The bitter irony, the men most at risk were the professionals doing everything right. The system punished excellence. The Germans had met this wall in 1939-40. Ju-87. Stuka units lost experienced pilots to no-pull crashes during combat trials. Their fix was blunt and effective. Remove the human from the critical moment. Engineers led by Hans Ulrich Rude added an automatic pullout controlled by a barometric preset. Before the dive, the pilot set a recovery altitude. At that pressure, pneumatic actuators hauled the stick back regardless of pilot condition. Conscious or unconscious, hands on or off the aircraft would recover. Losses from dive accident causes dropped dramatically within months. An unexpected bonus followed with a guaranteed floor. Stuka pilots could hold the dive longer and keep the sight on target through the last seconds without gambling their lives on perfect timing. American evaluators later inspected captured Stukas in North Africa. They noted the system and dismissed it. U.S. culture distrusted letting a machine fly the airplane. The verdict was that properly trained pilots shouldn't need such help. Train better, pull on time. That assumption carried into 1943 would cost more crews. The human toll forced a reckoning. March 22, 1943, off Florida. Lieutenant Robert Chen of Yorktown's Air Group 3 fails to recover on a routine hop. 5 days later, his former instructor, Lieutenant William Stamper, veteran of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, with more than 300 carrier landings, dives in the same way while shipmates watch through binoculars. Yorktown's commanding officer grounds the dive bomber element on the spot. Admiral Mark Mitcher orders the Bureau of Aeronautics to treat the losses as a systemic failure, not isolated accidents. The numbers are staggering. Between November 1942 and April 1943, 47 dive bomber pilots die in training pullouts, more than to enemy action in the same period. Combat squadrons report that 15 to 20% of pilots experience at least partial grayout during operational dives. In several strikes, wingmen must break off to escort blacked-out leaders home. An emergency panel at Anacostia gathers flight surgeons, aircraft designers, squadron leaders, and pilots who survived blackout incidents. For 3 days, they dissect the dive profile. Test pilots fly instrumented runs with medical sensors strapped to their chests, recording heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. High-speed cameras in chase aircraft capture the exact frame a head slumps or fingers loosen on the stick. The verdict is irrefutable. The standard dive bombing profile taught in every school is physiologically unsustainable. The Navy has been training pilots to execute a maneuver that human biology cannot reliably survive. Changing doctrine without destroying accuracy is the problem. Releasing higher and pulling earlier would save lives and ruin hit probability against agile warships. The Navy needs a way to keep the bomb true and the pilot conscious. The breakthrough comes from a surprising voice. Lieutenant J.G. Thomas Riley, who has flown from Enterprise since Midway, admits he has been quietly violating the book. Instead of initiating recovery at the prescribed 2,500 feet and releasing early in the arc, he holds the dive to about 2,000 feet sometimes. 800 releases while the aircraft is still nearly vertical, then executes a smoother, longer pullout that spreads the G over 7 or 8 seconds instead of 4. He reports no grayout, and his bombing scores are consistently the best in his squadron. Skepticism turns to silence when his gun camera film rolls. Bomb impacts cluster inside roughly 35 feet tighter than the 65-foot CEP, many commands call excellent. Aerodynamicists run the numbers. The standard technique releases as the nose is easing through about 60 degrees, which gives the bomb significant horizontal velocity and a long wind-sensitive parabolic path. Riley's low releases happen at 75 to 85 degrees. The bomb departs with minimal sideways speed and falls almost straight down. Flight time shrinks, wind matters less. The ballistic problem simplifies, accuracy improves. Physiology agrees. Holding the dive a heartbeat longer and then pulling out more gradually lowers the peak G to about 4.5 to 5 with a slower onset that the cardiovascular system can accommodate, especially if the anti-G strain starts before the pull. The result is the rarest gift in combat aviation, a change that makes the shot cleaner and the pilot safer at the same time. It sounds backward to instinct closer to the water pulling later. But the film, the accelerometer traces, and the centrifuge curves all point the same direction. The fix begins to take shape. Teach pilots to verbalize altitudes to keep cognition engaged, to start the anti-G strain early and hold it, to apply steady back pressure instead of one violent yank, to recognize the true sight picture of 1,800 feet, and to trust that a later release with a longer recovery can be both survivable and more accurate. That is where the Navy will go next. Rebuild the syllabus from the ground up, retrain bodies and habits, and measure whether the late pull, long pull method can stop the funerals and tighten the impact circles before the next major operation. The panel at Anacostia needed an answer that kept pilots alive without turning bombs into guesses. It began with a reversal that felt wrong to instinct, but right to physics. Hold the dive a heartbeat longer, then recover more gradually. Later release, longer pullout. The math and the medicine both pointed there. Accuracy hinges on two things: how much sideways speed the bomb carries at release and how long it has to wander before impact. Under the old profile, pilots pickled around 2,500 feet while already easing into recovery. The nose had crept from a 70-degree dive toward 60. The bomb left with a strong horizontal component and flew a long arc, more time for wind density ripples and tiny timing slips to push it wide. A tenth of a second late could mean 15 or 20 feet off the aim point. Thomas Riley's gun camera showed releases near 2,000 to 1,800 feet, sometimes lower, with the nose still 75 to 85 degrees down. The bomb fell almost straight. Horizontal travel shrank from roughly 180 feet to about 40. Flight time dropped. Wind mattered less. The ballistic problem simplified, and simplified problems hit tighter. Analysts admitted a quiet truth. The safety number of 2,500 feet had been chosen for recovery margin, not accuracy. It assumed a fully conscious pilot could survive a hard, short pull. The assumption failed. The number had to move. Physiology agreed. A later release with a smoother recovery spreads the altitude change over 7 or 8 seconds instead of cramming it into 4. Peak G slides from 6 or 7 down to about 4.5 to 5 below the line, where gray out cascades into blackout. Onset rate matters as much as peak. A slower build lets the cardiovascular system catch up, especially if the anti-G strain starts before the pull. Riley's habit: begin the strain early, hold the steep dive 1 beat longer, then feed in steady back pressure, kept him conscious, and put bombs into smaller circles. To prove it beyond argument, the Navy pulled 2 levers at once. NACA at Langley re-ran ballistic tables for ultra-low near-vertical releases. The dispersion curves tightened dramatically below 2,000 feet. Meanwhile, analysts re-indexed thousands of gun camera frames by release altitude. The pattern was unmistakable. The bracket between 1,600 and 900 feet delivered the tightest clusters dispersion that glide bombing used to claim at far lower speeds. Film and tunnel data said the same thing. Changing paper is easy, changing muscle memory is not. Commander James Flatley built a new syllabus at Jacksonville to retrain brains, bodies, and hands from the ground up. First came the body. Pilots sat through blunt physiology, what gray out is, why tunnel vision arrives in seconds, how onset rate pushes retinas into darkness and starves the brain. Surgeons drew blood flow maps and showed pressure traces from real dives. The message was simple: this is not about courage, it is plumbing. If you spike past 5.5 G too fast, the best stick in the fleet blacks out. The task is to shape the profile, not to tough it out. Instructors then taught the anti-G straining maneuver, properly timed, breaths, forced exhalations, leg and abdominal tensing, and drilled one crucial shift: start the strain before the pull and hold it through the arc. Next came the brain. Task saturation had been killing disciplined pilots who forgot to strain. The fix was a spoken cadence that kept cognition online and glued attention to altitude. Passing 3,000 holding angle, 2.5 holding, 2.0 sight picture steady, 1.8 begin pull. Crews repeated the calls in link trainers until the words came on rails. The cadence prevented altitude amnesia, cued the early strain, and steadied nerves over water. Then the eye. Old doctrine taught what 2,500 feet looked like. The new technique demanded fresh sight pictures for 1,800. Instructors built a library target size in the windscreen horizon, tilt the exact pipper position that meant now. Pilots learned that now at 1,800 does not resemble now at 2,500. They rehearsed steady back pressure rather than the single panic yank that spiked G and collapsed vision. The flying unfolded in rungs. First hops carried no ordnance with pullouts at 2,200 feet, only 300 below the old number, to prove the gentler arc. Chase planes called altitudes. Each sortie stepped lower: 2,000, 1,900, 1,800. Once habits held, flights worked selected profiles down toward 1,900 feet over safe water with pre-briefed floors and clean egress. Ordnance came last after eyes and hands were honest. Jacksonville published a pocket SOP to lock it in. Ingress dive brakes, set barometric bug-checked, anti-G prep verbalized, push-roll inverted slice to 70 to 80 degrees stabilize, track trim out, pitch hunt pipper steady call altitudes, release at or below 2,000 feet, 1,800 is the aim with the nose still steep, press the pickle, don't slap it. Recover strain already on, smooth continuous back pressure, wings level over seconds, not a snap. Egress, cross-check instruments and call clear. The mantra became late, pull long, pull low peak G. By August 1943, the results were plain. Graduates were releasing from 1,700 down to 900 feet with circular error probable under 40 feet and 0 G-induced incidents in training. The course ran 3 weeks longer than before, but squadrons that took the new pilots saw accuracy climb between 35 and 50%. Training accidents collapsed toward zero. Aviators still felt the old urge to yank early. The new habit answered with procedure, and procedure overruled fear. Skeptics raised the obvious objection: isn't late, just reckless. Two answers calmed them. Side-by-side film showed the late pull trajectory as a short, steep line with small dispersion, while the early pull run traced a long arc that magnified every breath of wind and tick of timing. Accelerometer plots showed lower peaks and slower onset, the exact envelope where vision and judgment stay intact. Commanders added one more layer: bugged personal hard floors on altimeters and chase ship oversight during transition. Nobody guessed. Everyone briefed, flew, and debriefed the same standard. Pilots reported 3 immediate cockpit changes. The sight picture stayed honest deeper into the run because the nose never crept early. The anti-G strain felt natural, starting before the pull and continuing through it rather than playing catch-up with their own physiology. The stick felt lighter because they were feeding pressure over time, not fighting a single violent heave. Instruments unwound smoothly instead of whipping. The Navy then scaled the method across the fleet. Classroom blocks traveled with carriers. Trainers carried the cadence into every ready room. Squadron leaders enforced the floors and the call-outs. Ballistics cards were reprinted with low-altitude lines bolded. The standard became the same on both oceans, steep to the last safe beat: pickle low, recover long. The fix stopped being an experiment and became the way. The payoff came quickly. Units flying the late pull profile reported accuracy gains of 1/3 to 1/2 over squadrons still using the old technique. More important, G-induced loss of consciousness incidents almost vanished. Pilots still respected the water, they just no longer met it in silence. The final step was psychological. Young aviators had to learn that closer was not the same as riskier. They learned to trust instruments when nerves screamed otherwise. They learned to let the cadence carry them through the last seconds, and to believe that a longer recovery is safer than a harder one. They learned that the body cannot be bullied, but it can be managed if the profile fits the plumbing. By the end of summer 1943, the late pull method had moved from proposal to expectation. Ready rooms spoke the new language. Instructors watched for the old snap pull and corrected it immediately. Wingmen listened for the cadence and echoed it under their breath. And when the first waves of retrained pilots reached the fleet, the change appeared on the only 2 charts that matter: tighter impact circles and fewer names on casualty lists. The doctrine had not been diluted, it had been refined. The bomb falls straighter, the pilot stays awake, the airplane comes home. The technique that once seemed suicidally dangerous became the standard by which other bombing methods were measured, because the men who trusted physics over instinct proved that pulling out late is how you live to be accurate. June 1944 put the new method to the only test that mattered: combat. Task Force 58 sailed into the Philippine Sea with 15 carriers for Operation Forager. In the 8 months prior, every dive bomber unit had been retrained in the late pull, long pull profile. Now they would find out if classroom physiology and ballistics tables could survive flak fighters and nerves. On 19th June, the day that would be remembered as the Great Marianas, turkey shoot controllers were swamped by successive waves of inbound Japanese aircraft. The call went out for dive bomber squadrons to abandon ship attack plans and break up the strike packages before they reached the fleet. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage took Bombing Squadron 10 off Enterprise to altitude and rolled his section through a curtain of sun and contrails. From 12,000 feet, where dive bombing had once been considered marginal, they drove in nose steep and held the sight through the enemy formation. They did not pickle early. Bombs left the racks below 2,000 feet at more than 280 knots, the airplane still nearly vertical, then eased into long recoveries that refused to spike the G-meter. The effect was surgical and brutal. Post-action reads credited VB-10 with destroying or damaging 23 Japanese aircraft in a single pass, numbers the old high-release profile could not touch. Ramage's own weapon struck a Kate with such precision that wreckage scattered for a quarter mile. Not one pilot in the section reported even a hint of grayout on the pullout. The broader picture matched the anecdotes. Across the Marianas operation, late pull squadrons posted hit rates around 32% against maneuvering warships well above the 18 to 22% that earlier battles had produced. In the 20 June carrier strikes, 14 of the 18 recorded direct hits by American dive bombers came from releases below 2,000 feet. The carrier Hio took 3 bombs in quick succession from VB-2 pilots who all released between 1500 and 1850. 2 bombs tracked the same elevator shaft. The ship rolled and sank within hours. Post-war inspection placed the impact points inside a rough 50-foot circle accuracy that would have sounded like fiction 18 months before. Survivability numbers shifted just as sharply. In the 6 months after the training overhaul, G-induced loss of consciousness incidents collapsed by more than 90% across carrier groups. No-pull accidents, once a grim constant of the schedule, shrank to fractions of a pilot per 1,000 sorties, down from double-digit rates during the worst months of early 1943. The crisis born of perfect technique and unforgiving biology had been solved not by harder men, but by a profile the body could actually fly. What the method changed most was scope. Ultra-low near-vertical releases meant a single Dauntless could mission-kill a destroyer and a 2-plane element could maul a cruiser's vitals. Squadrons no longer needed mass to be credible. Precision multiplied the weight of every bomb. The tactical tempo improved as well. Because pilots finished the pull conscious and composed reattacks, rejoins, and deck recoveries flowed instead of stuttering around medical limits, accuracy rose while fatigue and fear receded into checklists and habit. By April 1945, Okinawa, the doctrine was no longer new. Replacement pilots arriving from the training command had never learned the old sequence. To them, the idea of pickling high and yanking hard felt not just risky, but wasteful. They had been raised to ride the dive to an honest sight picture at 1,800 feet press instead of slap, and then let a smooth 7 or 8 second recovery bring the wings back to level. The cadence call the altitudes, start the strain before the pull, feed, and pressure ran in their heads the way any good instrument scan does. They trusted the physics because they had seen the film and flown the curves. The final ledger from the Pacific War tells the same story in numbers that planners care about. Dive bomber units trained in the delayed pull-out profile sank or damaged roughly 47% more enemy tonnage per sortie than squadrons that entered the war under pre-1943 methods. They did it with lower accidental loss rates, far fewer G-related incidents, and a confidence that changed how carrier air planned its day. What had been an area weapon accurate on average, imprecise in detail, became a precision tool aimed by nerves that no longer had to choose between sight picture and consciousness. Culturally, the shift was just as deep. The community stopped telling itself that courage could defeat physiology. Ready rooms taught plumbing and geometry alongside tactics. Leaders demanded verbal call-outs and hard altimeter floors. Wingmen listened for the cadence in the radio and echoed it under their breath. The late pull doctrine stopped being a workaround and became the professional standard steep to the last safe beat. Pickle low, recover, long, keep the peak G where the brain can see. When veterans looked back, the change felt both modest and enormous. Nothing high-tech had been added to the airplane. No exotic equipment rode in the cockpit. Pilots still dove, aimed, and flew. But the moment that used to kill the best among them, the perfect run that ended with no pull, was rewritten. The new habit made the shot simpler, the recovery survivable, and the mission reproducible. In the end, the men who forced themselves to trust math over instinct did not become reckless. They became precise. They learned to pull out too late by the old book, just in time by the only book that matters. They called it a fix, but it felt like a confession. Courage alone could not outfly the body. Pilots learned to treat pullouts as a medical problem with a tactical answer. The words changed in ready rooms. Not tougher, smarter, not higher, truer. The late pull was no longer a rumor traded between sections. It became the checklist voice in every cockpit. The human part lingered. Men who once white-knuckled the stick through 4 savage seconds now breathed on cadence and fed in pressure like pouring water. They trusted numbers they could not see, the onset rate of G, the fall time of a bomb, because film and traces had proved them right, and they taught the habit forward. New arrivals memorized sight pictures at 1,800 feet the way earlier classes memorized ship silhouettes. When instinct screamed to yank, training answered with procedure, and procedure won. The bias against automation softened too, not out of fashion, but from proof. The Stuka's barometric pullout wasn't a crutch. It was an acknowledgement that the critical second compresses human bandwidth to 0. American doctrine stayed manual through the war, but the lessons stuck: design failure modes that forgive. Post-war jets landed with stronger hook systems and better optical aids. G-suits spread. Training burned in the idea that the best fix is the one that still works when a pilot is task-saturated, scared, and tired. The ripple widened beyond dive bombing. Ordnance tables were rewritten with low near-vertical releases bolded. Debriefs treated physiology like weather. You could not argue it away, you planned around it. Air groups adjusted timelines so pilots arrived on target less wrung out. Even the language around errors changed. A late call on altitude wasn't a character flaw. It was a cue to reinforce cadence and anti-gait. The culture turned from blaming hands to shaping profiles. Numbers gave the story its last period. Accuracy rose by a third to a half. G-induced incidents fell into the noise. Tons sunk per sortie climbed, and the curve bent where it mattered most. Funerals slowed. The perfect run with no pullout, the nightmare that haunted flight lines in early 1943, vanished into rare anomaly. War remained dangerous, but it no longer ate its best men for doing exactly what they were told. What stays with you are the small scenes. A pilot reciting altitudes under his breath while sun glare turns the ocean to molten glass. A section lead pressing, not slapping the pickle at a sight picture he has practiced in a link trainer until it lives behind his eyes. A ready room where the loudest voice is a quiet rule: late pull, long pull, low peak G. In the logbook it reads like procedure. In the body it feels like margin, the difference between watching waves grow huge in the windscreen and watching them shrink below the wings. The method also reframed risk. The old way looked brave, release high, yank, hard, beat the water by nerve. The new way looked braver, and the only currency that mattered: trust. Trust the altimeter over the urge to flinch. Trust the breath and the strain you started before the pull. Trust that physics pays you back when you give it time to work. It is not a romantic idea, but it is the one that let crews walk back down the ladder at day's end. By Okinawa, teenagers fresh from Jacksonville spoke the doctrine as if it had always been there. They could not remember a time when men dove at ships and vanished without smoke or radio. They belonged to a generation for whom accuracy and awake were not trade-offs, but twins. In the end, the late pull did not make heroes bigger. It made the job smaller, small enough for humans to do every day. That is the quiet victory of good tactics. They turn miracles into repeatable acts. A bomb falls straighter. A hand stays steady. A mind stays lit through the seconds that decide everything. History will remember the dramatic days, the turkey shoot, the carriers, burning the photographs of bombs walking up a deck. But inside those frames is a quieter story about how a community rewrote a sentence in its own book. They had been taught to pull out early and hard. They learned to pull out later and long. It sounds like a line change. It was a life change. The lesson endures wherever people steer machines to the edge of what bodies can bear. When the task is complex and the moment is brief, design so the miss is survivable and the hit is simple. Trust the habit that keeps the lights on behind the eyes. And when instinct yells at you to yank, count, breathe, press, and give physics room to carry you home.